Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. Just thrilled we have so many people joining us for our webinar today. Today's event is brought to you by the Four Corners Lecture Series, the Bureau of Land Management Monticello Field Office, and Bears Ears National Monument in partnership with Edge of the Cedars State Park Museum, where I was just visiting our friend, Dr. Jonathan Till there, and can't wait to get back. So thank you to all of our partners in this webinar today. I'm going to just run through a few of our usual introductory slides, and I will try to move quickly. The repeat offenders are probably getting tired of this, but just I know everybody's really proficient with Zoom now, but if you need to move certainly my talking head or Bruce over a little bit so that you can see the slides, you just go to the dark bar over where the talking heads are and click on it and move those over. We do have a live transcription going. If you need to utilize that, please do. We say this all the time. Try to use the Q&A to type your questions in as opposed to the chat, because the chat can get a little bit busy and we might lose your question. If you have trouble with the Zoom, go ahead and head over. If you're on Facebook, we are live streaming right now, and then you can always come back and watch us again on our YouTube channel. So again, we're Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. We always like to just run through our mission, which is to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. And we have been doing a lot of interdisciplinary webinars and partnerships lately, like with our presenter today, which just really gives a lot of richness to our mission. As always, we acknowledge the descendants of the archaeological cultures on this landscape, the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Jicarilla Apache, who these are their traditional homelands where we work and where our campus is, and particularly to recognize that Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, everything that we do is dependent upon our partnerships and relationships with Indigenous people, past, present, and future. We are extremely grateful for descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions, not just to Crow Canyon, but to all of humankind. And we are extremely grateful, and we support the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands in everything that we do. So here's my last big pitch. I won't belabor it, but we've got our thermometer up here. One of our trustees, we're actually in the middle of our board of trustees meetings right now, and I would love to be able to tell our trustee who made this $50,000 challenge match that we've pushed it over the edge. So everyone's been so generous. I can't even thank enough the folks, all of our viewers who give us multiple contributions all the time. But this is a special time this year to do it, because every dollar you contribute will be matched. We'll have an extra $50,000 in addition to your contributions to dedicate to this webinar series next year as well. Technology, scholars, everything, just to help us make this experience as much fun for all and informative for all of you as possible. So please give it a thought. If you're going to make that donation, please consider doing it soon or today, so that we can blow this thermometer out of the water. We've got some upcoming webinars in the next couple of weeks. Our partnership with the Haisatsinome chapter, we love all of you, is presenting Hopi history at the Hamalvi Settlement Cluster with Dr. Chuck Adams, who was also one of the original archaeologists at Crow Canyon in the early 80s. And then the week after that, again, another presentation from the Four Corners Lecture Series presents the Maze Database Project, a Hopi Crow Canyon collaboration with Dr. Mark Varian, and who is a dear friend and longtime colleague of mine, and I will be hosting that webinar as well. In addition to contributing to the webinars, a lot of our viewers want to know if there are places where they can contribute to our Native American partners who have been incredibly hard hit, disproportionately so from COVID. So you can snap a picture of these links if you'd like to donate to our Native American friends and partners, or just let us know and we can send you some links as well. All right, without further ado, let's just move into our lecture. We are so grateful to have Dr. Bruce Pavlik here with us to give this talk. I'm extremely excited to see Dr. Pavlik got his PhD in botany from UC Davis. He is an expert in his research on the ecology and physiology of plants native to Western North America, including the conservation of endangered species. He asked that I didn't necessarily read his entire bio and all of his accomplishments, but he is now the director of conservation at Red Butte Garden and Arboretum at the University of Utah, which Taylor and I both think is the coolest job ever. So thank you so much for joining us, Bruce. And without anything else, I am going to pass it off to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Really appreciate the intro and hearing everything that goes on with Crow Canyon. All right. This talk is a collaborative effort between a lot of people, and I just want to introduce briefly my co-authors on this project, which, by the way, was published this year in the Proceedings of the National Academy. Elizabeth Lauterbach is an archaeologist with the Natural History Museum of Utah, and she specializes in archaeobotany and particularly the ecology of diets in the Western U.S. Blake Vernon and Peter Jaworski are graduate students at the University of Utah in anthropology under the direction of our co-author Brian Cotting, who is a very well-known archaeologist and a whiz at modeling and taking our field data and putting it to the test. And Cynthia Wilson, some of you know, is a Indigenous food sovereignty expert, nutritionist, Bears Ears advocate, and working with Utah Dene Bikea. And Arnold Clifford is also renowned as a botanist, Dene botanist, who is amazingly expert at not only the traditional elements of Navajo botany, but the Western botany and all the cultural aspects that go along with plants. So we were really fortunate to put this team together for this project, which we're titling Archaeoecosystems of Bears Ears National Monument. And archaeoecosystems is simply a term we use to not only talk about the artifacts, the features, the sites of archaeology, but the resource base that surrounds them, both past and present. And it's that resource base that made the habitations possible, so that we're trying to look at this as a whole. And that's what that term archaeoecosystems is trying to convey. Now, as many of you know, Bears Ears was originally designated by President Obama. And there's a couple of things I want to point out in some of the celebratory language and the policy language that went along with the designation of Bears Ears. Bears Ears as a place that is relatively undisturbed and biodiverse and a resilient landscape, a very important place for not just Navajo people, but for all of the 5 tribes that came together to argue on behalf of this amazing landscape. And then in the proclamation for the National Monument, I just want to point out the language that says, ensure that management decisions affecting the monument reflect tribal expertise and traditional and historic knowledge. So our project is really aimed at developing information that will eventually go into that set of management decisions and that perspective that incorporates traditional ecological knowledge. So archaeoecosystems is about understanding the ecological context around archaeological sites. And we are in particular interested in the subsistence base, broadly speaking, particularly the plants, and asking the question, is that subsistence base around archaeological sites intentional or coincidental? And to get at that, we'll be looking at the patterns of plant diversity across the Bears Ears landscape, and in particular, look at what we're calling ethnographic species richness, or ESR. That's simply a way of saying the plants that were important and are important to native people of this region. If you tallied up the number of species, that would be a measure of this thing called ethnographic species richness. And also, we would be documenting significant occurrences of populations of those ethnographic species, because we believe that they too deserve management. And that leads to the third point, that should the management of Bears Ears be more than just the archaeological features, more than just the artifacts, but should it be aimed at this broader context of the archaeoecosystem? So in designing this study, we had a hypothesis that larger sites, more complex sites, would be associated with a higher richness of culturally significant plant species. That is is to say higher ESR. And we would develop regional and site-specific databases, so we knew what plants occurred where, and we would be able to document ESR. And then another aspect would be to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge and practices, make recommendations as to how that could be done. And part of that would be developing models that help identify areas in Bears Ears for special management regimes, not just for the archaeology, but the plant life as well. Well, many of you know that in Bears Ears, there's over 100,000 sites that have been identified that occur in the SHPO database of sites. And so obviously we have a sampling problem here because we can't visit all 100,000 sites. So we developed some criteria that we would use to help whittle down to get to a reasonable number of sites. The criteria candidates could be on BLM or Forest Service land. They could have complex habitation, site, archaeology or agricultural terraces. And then from the standpoint of management, they may also be highly visited, so they'd be subject to a lot of human disturbance. And then we wanted to get them geographically dispersed across the landscape. So ultimately, we ended up with, so far in several years of field study, 31 sites that have been characterized, 9 that were randomly chosen from ones that had habitation and ag terraces, 6 that were opportunistically chosen, meaning that we came across them as we were doing field work. And so we said, why not survey these? So that's what that means. And then 16 that were selected just simply to meet one or more criteria. We couldn't do random sampling. We learned this in the first year, random sampling of everything, because we would not get the geographic spread and we wouldn't get the range of habitation structures or archaeological features that we needed to have. So that's how we got our 31 sites. And then we began field work. We had independent teams of archaeologists and botanists go out, usually 2 of each, sometimes more. And that field work took place in the fall of 2017, the spring of 2018. and then the fall of 2019, and then just this fall, 2021. And so we recharacterized the sites with site metrics. We didn't rely upon the the forms that were present in the SHPO database. So we actually remeasured the sites, the dimensions of all habitational structures. We looked at the occurrences of artifacts and abundances, the condition they were in. We looked at again, the metrics so we could determine the density of features. And then the botanists were working on the ecosystem characteristics, focused mostly on the plants that were present, but also describing the geomorphology, the vegetation, the substrate, the condition, the metrics of the ecosystem, where the edges were, how we define those edges. And then they also collect voucher specimens, emphasizing known ethnographic plant species. In terms of understanding those patterns of plant diversity and determining ESR, our specimens, our vouchers were annotated by Arnold Clifford, and they are deposited at the Garrett Herbarium. Arnold also provided the Navajo names, which are now on those data sheets as well. And then when we had our list of plants, which I'll kind of show you a mock-up of in a second, we determined how they were used by consultation, not only with Arnold and others, but also consulting well-known databases, the Native American Ethnographic database, and as well as standard reference materials. Emphasizing tribes that have Bears Ears ancestry, the 5 tribes, Navajo, Hopi, Ute, Mountain Ute, Zuni, and Apache. And then we compiled the list of plants and annotated them with respect to whether they were used as food or medicine, they had ceremonial purposes, or we just had a catch-all category called general utility. And then ultimately, when we had our ESR estimates, we regressed that on various explanatory variables, which I'll show you, to see what the patterns were across the landscape. In terms of management, we made records of site disturbance of all sorts, the trails, vandalism, livestock impacts, fire, flood, weeds. And then we had spent a number of days with Arnold touring sites, and particularly had a long session up at Kagalia, and then interviewed Arnold and Carlos Baca, who has a very strong interest in Bears Ears. He's an indigenous foods chef and is quite well versed in the flora of the region. We wanted to get their views on Bears Ears and its management and its plant resources. So that was recorded, and those conversations are actually transcribed in reports that are available from BLM. And then finally, the modeling, when we had all of our data with all the various field seasons combined. So in terms of what we were finally able to do, like I said, we had field seasons in 2017, 2019, 2018 as well, and 2020. And we were able to visit with our survey teams 31 sites across Bears Ears, as far north as Round Tower up in Beef Basin, and now as far south as River House Ruin, which is not shown on this map. We don't have the 2021 data fully mapped out and analyzed yet. But in other words, we have really great geographic spread in a wide variety of areas, and a very wide range of archaeological complexity. And just to show you briefly, some of these sites are very well known, very heavily visited, like House on Fire, the Beef Basin sites. Others are much more obscure, harder to find. Elk Ridge was basically, I think, a small hunting camp. And then on what we're calling Rockwall Alcove on Combs Ridge was looked like it was just a hunting blind. So a wide range of sites, a wide range of structural complexity as far as the archaeology is concerned. So this is a distillation of what we did in those years. So you can see a number of sites surveyed, 15 in our first fall and spring, to 10 and then to 6. And the reason they fall off like that is mostly because we're going to more and more complex sites that are more and more difficult to get to. So the approaches in particular this fall could take hours. And so that's one reason why we didn't do the same number of sites in every year. In terms of how they were selected in that first year, we had those random sites and opportunistic sites. In the second year, we chose them depending on their archaeological significance and also to get dispersion across Bears Ears. And in the final year, this year, we tried to choose the most complex sites, those with high visitation, those that attract a lot of people, to see what condition they're in and to see what plants are present still. Target features, habitations in all years. In the first year, we tried to find ag terraces and small camps. So ultimately, even though the number of sites was decreasing, the number of major features was increasing every year that we were finding, and that is because we were measuring more and more complex sites with a range of features per site, anywhere from 0 sites that just didn't work out in terms of archaeology to sites that can have up to 41 major features. And then here are sites that had a high number of features in those years. Some of you may have visited these before. And then the total number of plants, and this is a cumulative list. So we, in the first year, compiled a list of 79 ethnographic plant species. That list went to 116 in our next year. And then we haven't yet compiled what we found this year. It's all specimens that need to be gone over very carefully. So we'll probably add to that list. And the range of ESR per site. So this is the number of ethnographic species per site. So in the first year, 4 to 25, and then in the second year, up to 27 species per site. And some sites having a very high ESR. So I realize that it's impossible to see the yellow list, and that's just because it's huge. Basically, I'm just showing this as an example. Running down the left side over here, this is a list of the species alphabetically arranged, nothing special there, but going on from 1 to 116. And then over to the right, we have these major uses of food, medicine, ceremony, and utility. And what I'm showing on the green here is just a blow up of this first section. So here are species 1 is Acer negundo, that's the box elder, and going down through the A's, you can see. And then here are those use categories. And here are our 5 major tribes, so Navajo, Hopi, Ute Mountain Ute, Zuni, and Apache. And then these letters are annotations indicating we have a confirmation of who used that plant for what purpose. So we know exactly where the information came from. So that makes sense. And it was very interesting to see if we take a species like Artemisia frigida, which is a type of sage, and just look at all of the uses by all of the tribes, we get an idea of something that we're calling ethnographic breadth, meaning some measure of how many uses it had by how many tribal groups. So if we sum up all these letters here, just count them across, we get this measure of breadth. And there were species that had high breadth. In other words, a lot of use by a lot of tribes. And of course, Pinus edulis, the two-leaf pinyon pine, would be on there. Mahonia fremontii, Fremont's bearberry, seemed to be used by everybody for a large number of purposes. So then we had moderate breadth species and low breadth species, and then species that are known from the archaeological record in southern Utah. So that's a category that we got not from our field work, but rather from looking in the archaeological literature. So we could see what had been used in the past and what is present on the landscape now, and who's using it for what purpose. If we tally down in a food category, for example, for Navajo, we could tally the number of ethnographic species that the Navajo used for food, the number that they used for medicine. So like 34 is the sum of all the annotations that we had going down this column here. For medicine, going down this column. For ceremony, going down this column. So again, we could see who was using these plants very widely. And again, this is kind of a very biased thing because there's a lot in the literature about Navajo botany, and there's much less in the literature about Mountain Ute botany. So we don't think this is accurate in the sense that, gee, they only used one plant for utility, but we just do not have much in the way of ethnographic record for some tribes for these plants. So it kind of tells us where we're at in terms of really getting to record this very important knowledge. Okay, so the blue table here is a different table from the one I just explained. Again, we start with the list 1 to 116 of all the plant species that we were able to document at these sites. And then on this axis here, instead of looking at uses and tribes, we're actually looking at the sites themselves. And so to give a blow up of that, the first plants again, here's the box elder. These are some of the sites. And if they had an X, that means it was found at Mule Canyon, or it was found in Upper Dry Wash. And this allows us to see, first of all, if we tally down for a site, excuse me, if we add up all the X's going down for a site, that's how we get ethnographic species richness. So ESR for a given site is the sum number of taxa per site, number of plants that we found there of ethnographic significance. But also of interest is tallying over this way, left to right, counting the number of X's and comparing them to the number of sites. We get this measure called frequency. That is, it's really the probability of occurring at a given site, the number of occurrences, the number of X's that one finds in a row, divided by the number of sites surveyed. So this frequency begins to tell us something, which is the probability of finding it at archaeological sites. So in terms of ESR, there were sites that had extremely large numbers of ethnographic plants in the immediate vicinity. 24 to 27 plant taxa, for example, at House on Fire. Even though it's visited quite often, there's still a lot of plants there that are of ethnographic significance. Arch Canyon, what we're calling high ESR, 18 to 23 is the range. And those are above or at the mean ESR for all sites of 18. And then moderate to low. Some of the camps had very low ESR. So we had a wide range of sites and a wide range of ESR as well. And then in terms of the plants and their frequency, there are some plants that we know are all over the landscape. They have frequencies above 50%. So things like juniper, Utah juniper, or pinyon pine, or gamble oak. So these are high frequency species. They're just about everywhere on the landscape. And because they're ubiquitous, they don't really tell us much about those sites. But we had a number of low frequency, in other words, present in only 7 to 20% of all the sites that we call discriminating taxa. These were species that were present at archaeological sites, but relatively rare on the landscape. And they included things like Chenopodium berlanderi, which is a form of quinoa, Chenopodium fremontii, quinoa again, Lycium pallidum, a very well-known species of ethnographic significance, the wolfberry, Shepherdea rotundifolia, the round leaf Shepherdea. And then one of our favorites that we've been working on for many years, Selenium James Eye, the four corners potato. And also this beautiful little Tradescantia. It's a spiderwort. Here's the Selenium James Eye, by the way. So we felt that these taxa told us something about sites more so than these. Now you might say, well, maybe ESR is just a function of the area around the archaeological site that we ended up sampling. We measured where our site locations were. We also measured where the survey took place, where we actually collected the plants. And if you look for a correlation between sample area and ethnographic species, you don't find one. In other words, it doesn't matter large or small area, it had no relationship to ethnographic species richness. We look for a relationship between elevation and ethnographic species richness. And again, there was none. So we don't go up in elevation to find more plant species or go down. It doesn't make any difference. We looked for a pattern with latitude going north and south. Were there more plants up in Beef Basin than there were down at River Run? And the answer to that is no, no relationship with latitude. But we did find a significant east-west correlation with a peak somewhere in the middle of Bear's Ears. So that's very interesting. That begins to tell us something about where these plants are on the landscape. And then we were also able to test the relationship between ESR and a number of environmental and archaeological variables. So we tested the slope of the site. In other words, was it west-facing steep slope, east-facing shallow slope, a moisture index that would tell us where there's more moisture on the landscape, growing degree days, which is a measure of thermal suitability for plant development, the size of the site, the archaeological site that is, the number of features of the site. And so when you do these, you find that two variables had a significant effect on ESR. The one with the strongest effect was growing degree days. And you can see here, and these are significant at less than a 5% chance of a type 2 error. So with longer growing degree days, and what really that means is longer growing season, greater species richness of ethnographic species. But also, and this is where we come down to this idea that there is ecological legacy here, the number of archaeological features, the number of architectural features, that is specifically looking at habitation structures, as they increase, the ESR also increases. And there's no other possible explanation for this relationship, because it would be highly unusual for people to select sites to live that would be based on a naturally occurring species richness. In other words, other variables like the presence of water or the way the site is exposed to the sun, or maybe relationship to where the soil is deep. Those are the more important variables with which to choose a habitation site. And so given this relationship, it sort of looks like the more investment there was in archaeological features, the more people would have been present on the site. And the greater the probability is that they made an investment in bringing species to that site for their purposes of food, medicine, ceremony, or just general utility. We took our model based on archaeological features and growing degree days and made a prediction of where ESR would be highest across Bears Ears at 265 sites in the SHPO database. So this is a multivariate generalized model, additive model. And what we find is this east-west pattern. There seems to be a band of high ESR sites in this region, not so much to the north, and certainly not over here to the east, but rather in through here. So our model is starting to tell us where we should be looking for sites that have these remnant plant populations, this ecological legacy that goes along with architectural features. Now, a part of that story about plants being found in and around archaeological sites are these low frequency species that I mentioned, like wolfberry and this species. This is Selenium James Eye. This is the Four Corners potato. And we did a model, sorry. We did a model that used climatic data from a compiled list of sites for the Four Corners potato alone across its natural range, basically from southern Utah down all the way to the Mexican border. We used that climatic data and where the potatoes occurred in that huge landscape, and asked the question, where does those climate parameters occur within Bears Ears? So what was developed was this habitat suitability model. And what you see here is high suitability sites for the potato are yellow, and low suitability sites are in the blue-green areas here. In other words, these are places where the potato would grow very well, and these are places where it wouldn't grow so well. And what's interesting is that all of the known occurrences of the Four Corners potato in and around Bears Ears are in low suitability sites. In other words, not sites that appear to be natural. There's a cluster down here of known sites, and then a cluster up here just outside of the borders. So again, how does a species come to grow in an area where ecologically it probably shouldn't be there? I mean, that's the definition of a crop. And to illustrate this, I'll show you one of the more remarkable findings of our surveys in looking at this particular archaeological site, which is a really amazing two-story structure. Going around the bedrock rim above this two-story structure, at the base of a slick rock waterfall, which you can see to the left here, there's a little patch of sand that's sort of caught by a sandstone lip here. So water would run down into that patch of sand. And lo and behold, growing in that patch of sand, miles and miles from any other plants of its own kind, is Selenium James Eye, the four corners potato. There's no natural natural dispersal mechanism that we know of that would bring Selenium James Eye into this sand patch so perfectly positioned below a bedrock waterfall. So, as I mentioned, we spent a good amount of time with Arnold Clifford, both looking over plants and being in the field and hearing the cultural traditions associated with these plants. Wonderful presentation that he made to our group. And we also spent time with Carlos Baca in the field and talking to him about the importance of bear's ears and food from bear's ears to the idea of indigenous cuisine. And that field trip with Arnold was truly amazing. And I'm quoting his interview where he said here, every plant out here probably has a use and is sacred to the Navajo people. And that was, kind of a revelation. We generally think of ethnographic species as being a subset of the flora, but there literally wasn't a plant we could pass by that Arnold couldn't tell us something really interesting about. So we have a record of this. As I mentioned, this interview is available, transcribed. And then talking to Carlos about his perspective on bear's ears, basically saying that there's food all over the place, that that food is something that they look at as being important now, that could provide for their people if they had access to it, and if they tended it, if they managed it. And so there was some very strong opinions about bear's ears and the plants of bear's ears and how they could be preserved, but how they could also be used. And so again, I bring us back to that idea of the original proclamation for the monument, that we're talking about tribal co-management here of these resources, of these archaeoecosystems, of these plant resources. And we really need to hear what people like Arnold and Carlos are saying. But it also presents quite a problem. And it actually leads us to the question of whether the Department of Interior can actually incorporate traditional ecological knowledge in the management of plant resources in places like bear's ears, if all species are sacred and if all species have a use. I mean, that's basically saying you have to manage everything. And so obviously the answer to that question is, well, no, we can't do all. So what are we going to do? What is the best way of putting traditional ecological knowledge to use in the management of these resources. And so this is an idea that really stemmed from our conversations with a number of people, but particularly with Arnold and Carlos, that we may be able to prioritize the plants of Bears Ears for management purposes, and use sort of broad indicators to kind of whittle down that list of 116 species to perhaps just a few that we could get experience with, that we could allow Native Americans access to and allow them to manage. So Carlos mentioned there's a subset of plants in Navajo tradition called Lifeway medicines. And there's 7 or 8 species in particular that occur in Bears Ears, like this Paccara, formerly called Senecio, and Selenium James Eye happens to be one of those Lifeway medicines. This is a relatively small category. Like I said, maybe just a handful of Lifeway medicines that we need to be concerned about, where they occur in the landscape and how they're impacted by visitation. There are others that are indicators of former habitation. Some of them are really well known. I mean, it goes back to 1965 in a really important paper that was written about species that tended to occur in archaeological sites, like Lycium pallidum, the wolfberry on the right, or Cleome cerulata. So those are habitation indicators. They're a relatively small number. Perhaps we can manage for them. And then, of course, any species that are rare or uncommon in the sort of the more traditional conservation sense, like this Sorothamnus and the Tradescantia, which is not a rare species, but is not terribly common across the Bears Ears landscape. So this provides a framework for at least getting our feet wet with incorporating traditional knowledge, incorporating regulatory elements, and learning how to actually do co-management. So to kind of sum up, we reject our initial hypothesis that larger sites, it's actually more dense sites that are associated with a higher richness of culturally significant plant species. It's not large, it's being complex and compact, indicating large numbers of people, perhaps over long periods of time. And then with our second goal, we've now developed these regional and site-specific databases of plant species richness. We know the probability of finding them, and we have some good idea, excuse me, of how frequent they are across the landscape. And then finally, with management, can we incorporate traditional ecological knowledge and practices? Can we use a framework like the Lifeway medicines to tell us which species should have high priority? And we have developed a model that identifies areas for special regimes. So again, smaller sites with dense features appear to be embedded in ecosystems with high ESR, perhaps the ecological legacy of past human investment in those sites. And the sorry, sites with very high ESR have multiple habitation rooms and granaries and cysts, drainage systems, multiple vegetation types and local ecological diversity. And those are the sites that should rise up, be high priority for management. And so far, 116 ethnographic plant species documented. Oh, it shouldn't be 15 sites, should be 31 sites so far, sorry. With an ESR range of up to 27 taxa per site. 27 taxa with moderate to high ethnographic breadth, meaning a lot of uses and a lot of tribes that use them. And then 8 taxa with low frequency that tell us something about their occurrence across the landscape, and perhaps their priority for management. And then our model predicting this zone of peak ESR, which kind of focuses where on the landscape we should be looking for these complex archaeoecosystems. And again, in terms of management, prioritize dense habitation sites in peak ESR zones. Then prioritize Lifeway Medicines, habitation indicators, and rare common species as a way of starting to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge. And then to suggest proactive site-specific management regimes. In terms of scientific approach, overall habitat quality, we should be looking at things like weed removal, particularly things that sup up the water, like tamarisk that occurs at a number of sites. We want to maintain ecological processes like water storage and flow and riparian areas, soil integrity, crust, that sort of thing. Minimize human and livestock disturbance. And then the traditional proactive management, maybe we should be considering wild cultivation of high priority plant populations, plant populations that were most probably managed in the past, maybe even created. Sorry, I got a frog. So I just want to recognize, again, this is a collaborative project. A lot of people, field archaeologists and botanists, GIS experts, our Navajo collaborators, SHPO, and finally BLM funding, which was really important. Obviously, you can't take this many people out into the field with that much expertise without funding and support. And so we really appreciate the funding that came from the BLM Monticello office for our project. So thank you very much.
There we go. Thank you so much, Bruce. A fantastic presentation. And let's see, we've got about 9 minutes left and we should be able to get to a number of questions. I'm going to start with some of the open ones online, and Taylor is sending me the Facebook questions. Actually, I'll start with the one that came in on Facebook. The question to you, Bruce, is a lot of traditional people say to preserve the plants, you have to use them. Is there room for this philosophy at Bears Ears?
Well, that's what I was suggesting at the end. I really think this is up to the powers that be, the committee that is formed for co-management. And there are people that have this expertise already, like Carlos does manage potato populations out in the wild, places that he and his grandfather had visited, known, and tended. I think that expertise is there. And I think not only is there room for it, I think it's exactly what's called for in the proclamation. I can't hear.
It looks like you're muted, Liz.
Sorry about that. Thank you. I had my Q&A covering my face. All right. We have a couple of questions that have come in around how has the drought affected the numbers of plant species counted at the sites?
Well, we had a couple of good years. The monsoon this year was pretty good. And so things like potato were up. They were not up in 2019 or 2020. So some of the more ephemeral things in terms of being above ground, are sort of transient. But of those 116 plant species, about 90% are perennials. They're not ephemeral annuals. So they're either up, I think 56% are shrubs. So they're up all the time, no matter what. and the rest are herbaceous perennials. And yeah, they will fluctuate, but we feel like we got a pretty good handle on them.
Oh, fantastic. Kind of another question from a different participant, sort of along some of the lines that you just described, wanted to know about any non-native plants found, and with respect to the invasive species, kind of how many were they, how many were there, and what were they like?
Not that many non-native things. There were, well, the worst, of course, I think, is the tamarisk, which is just coming up all the little, drainages and such. Not a really big problem in some areas, like at House on Fire. I mean, you could go through with a crew and in one day knock out everything that's in that Mule Canyon, at least that section of Mule Canyon, not the whole thing. But so in some places, tamarisk is a real problem, and it probably is an overwhelming problem farther south as you get along the major drainages. And then other things like the Portulaca oleracea, which is invasive, was everywhere this year. I don't know. I mean, it looked like there was just spongy red soil covering everywhere. Not much you can do about that. But otherwise, not too bad. Again, I think the riparian areas are the places that are most impacted. Oh, we had to whack our way through a 6-foot tall cocklebur forests in some places. That was kind of a bummer, but not so much at the archaeological sites. I would say only tamarisk and Portulaca were the ones that were most impactful in those places.
Excellent. And kind of along the lines of the previous question around drought, I have a question coming in to my text about domesticated animals along those lines, and the impact on the area.
Well, we have notes on specific places. There seem to be some places that the cattle get to fairly easily, and other places that they don't get to at all. So, and in those places they can get to, you can find, feces on the archaeological sites. I mean, literally hanging off the walls and inside. So I think they go up and they seek shade, in some of the overhangs and places like that. So there's a handful of sites where that is the case, but a lot of other sites appear to be just too inaccessible for them to get to.
Excellent. One of our listeners wanted to know that if there's any possibility of permitting visitation within the framework of management of these plants.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think human visitation.
Having a permit.
Maybe, yeah.
Well, I think that's a very interesting idea. I mean, visiting these sites with a knowledgeable guide would be an incredible experience, and it would also be a way of managing, where people went and what trails they took, and whether they picked up that pottery shirt or not. Mm-hmm. I think that kind of regulated visitation would be fantastic, and it would bring money to people that are knowledgeable. Some of that's going on already. We were out at the River House ruin, and there were some guided trips coming down the river that stopped at the ruin and looked at it. It would be nice if again they had this broader perspective of the archaeoecosystem to look around and say, gee, here's the resource base that partially made this possible. So I think it could be greatly expanded and should be a part of the management planning.
Excellent. A lot of our folks are very interested in protection of Bears Ears in these sites, and we had a question come in about how could they, is there upcoming legislation or other ways of protecting Bears Ears that interested people could support?
I wish I knew of such things. Right now, the Utah congressional delegation is uniformly against the expansion of the boundaries that Biden had just announced. And money for management obviously has to be appropriated by Congress. So if our delegation is against the monument, it seems like there's a low probability of legislation actually making its way. That's the next most difficult nut to crack. I've said for a long time, boundaries are one thing, but that's not the problem. The problem is how to go forward with these lands and these resources into the future. So I am very concerned, and I kind of wish that there had been more negotiation with respect to securing management funds.
I might just coincidentally, just to add to that answer, we had a committee meeting of our board and staff today where we talked about the expansion, and we believe there would be a management plan out for public comment at some point, and our staff here at Crow Canyon will be interested in reading that and making comments. And I think other scholars such as yourself would be able to weigh in that, and just the avocational public. I think you could keep an eye out for that, and Taylor and I will keep an eye out for when that comes out, and post an announcement on our webpage and social media as well.
We really need a congressional advocate, and I would say targeting someone like maybe John Curtis, who's a little more interested in a broader reaction. You need an advocate in Washington. We need an advocate for Bears Ears in Washington that is got the power reins, not just all the tribal groups and not just the environmental groups. We need someone to really talk about legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's 5:01, but I want to ask this last question that just came in, because it's I'm interested in it too. I think you'll be as well. This gentleman asks, over many years wandering southern Utah, I've noticed this phenomenon of correlation of potentially edible plants with archaeological sites. I developed the hypothesis that archaeological sites occur in sites with favorable microclimate. Cattle tend to favor the sites and eat the same plants that people do and bring seeds with them. And did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that's absolutely true. And I was trying to think of the paper going back to 1965 is Yarnell mentioning, this broad correlation of these ethnographic significant plants and the archaeological sites. And again, we tried to model, all these different variables, and the only one that could explain ESR at a high level of significance was growing degree days, which was interesting, wasn't it? Moisture. And it may be because these are perennials, and so they can weather a drought year or two, or even several consecutive. So it's not so much moisture as it looks like it's growing degree days, particularly for things like the potato, which is a subtropical species. It really requires a certain growing season length and the monsoonal rains. The monsoonal rains are absolutely critical to that species, not so much the woody perennials. So again, it's growing degree days and architectural features, site density that came out in our study.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're over time, and we got to a lot of questions, and I think Taylor is able to send out some emails if folks want to pass on these questions. And other than that, thank you so much, Bruce, for fantastic and fascinating presentation.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And hopefully you and others don't forget, we have an annual meeting this Saturday that is in a webinar format on October 16th at 10 a.m. It will be lots of fun, some great presentations from our archaeologists and program staff. So
wonderful.
Bruce, maybe you want to join us as well.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
And we hope to see you Saturday and next week.